Good afternoon and welcome to everyone who's joined this afternoon's webinar. My name is Dr. Michael Devlin and I'm Head of Professional Standards and Liaison here at the MDU. And sitting with me and co-broadcasting this afternoon is Dr. Caroline Fryer, who will introduce herself in a moment or two. But if I may, I'd just like to go through some housekeeping points, and that will also give those who are joining the meeting over the next few minutes the chance to log in and get up to speed. First thing to say is that although you can hear and see us, we can't hear or see you, but we can communicate with you, and I'll come to that in a second. But what you should have on your screen is, for the next few minutes, you'll have a little small picture of myself and Caroline, and that will go once the presentation starts. And then you'll have a main screen that has the slideshow itself. Now, what you will have, probably in the right-hand corner of your screen, is a panel. And if that's hidden, there'll be a little orange arrow which you just need to click on. On that panel, there are a couple of boxes that I would like to draw to your attention. One of these is the box that allows you to vote in our polls, and we'll tell you when that will be activated. And the other thing is there's a little box that allows you to ask questions. So although I said we can't hear you, we can hear from you, and I would really encourage you to ask us questions as you go along, when prompted, or at the end. So we do look forward to hearing from you, and we do hope that you enjoy this afternoon's webinar, and I'll just hand over to Caroline, who will introduce herself now.
Good afternoon. So I'm Dr. Caroline Fryer. I'm Head of Medico-Legal Advisory Services here at the MDU, and as Mike says, this afternoon we're going to be looking at the complexities in risk and clinical liability and indemnity for new care models. I can see we have a fair number of attendees now, so what I'm going to do is turn off our webcam and we will begin with the presentation. So if you just give me one moment. Okay, so you will have already been provided with the detailed learning objectives for today, but to give you a brief overview of what we're going to look at in this 45 minutes or so session, we're going to begin by looking at the background to medical indemnity and indeed how things have developed since the MDU was set up back in 1885. We'll look in particular at key changes in legislation that have impacted on medical indemnity and in particular show you the changes in claims patterns that have resulted. We're then going to consider the 5-year forward view and the proposed new models of care and the changing scope of medical practice that we're now seeing. We'll have a look at current indemnity options and compare some of the common terms that you may hear when considering your choices. And finally, we'll look at multiple jeopardy, by which we mean, of course, we're here to help our members with adverse incidents, and one of the things that flows from that is claims, but there are many other lines of investigation that can result. So we'll highlight some of those to you so that you're aware of all of these things. So to begin with, we have a short video which is about the background to medical indemnity. Now this is an MDU promotional video that was set up to show our 130-year history, and it is quite promotional. It's about the MDU. It tells you how things have developed over the last 130 years. There clearly are other defence organisations, and I ask you to bear with it and hopefully get the historical points from it as we move forward. So I'll play that now. It lasts just over 2 minutes, and then we'll move on to some further parts of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, and we hope you enjoyed that little walk through the history of the MDU. And as Caroline was saying, the important thing to get out of that, in our opinion, is how things have changed in terms of costs. Now, what I'd like to do is talk you through this graph. Hopefully it's fairly self-explanatory, but if you imagine a claim in 2009 is roughly one per year, then by 2015 it's increased 2.5 times almost. Now obviously it is more than one per year and it's substantially more than 2.5 times per year, but that just shows you the relative increase in the number of GP claims reported year on year. And I hope you'll agree that really is a quite staggering increase in quite a short period of time. Now, you'll also notice at the end of that video that the highest claim to date that the MDU has received is £9.2 million. I'm afraid to say that large claims themselves are not unusual. For example, the claim on the left-hand side of your screen, 8.4 million, that relates to a GP claim relating to an alleged failure to refer following a subarachnoid hemorrhage. And the £6.8 million claim, another GP claim, and that relates to allegations that there was a failure to diagnose meningitis in a timely way. Now, the big question is, why are claims going up at the rate they are? Why are huge claims no longer rare? Well, I'll talk you through the last 15 years because there have been changes to the way claims are litigated that we think has had quite a profound impact. Going to the mid-1990s and later, all of a sudden the market in terms of claims was opened up because solicitors began to charge no-win, no-fee arrangements in order to allow patients to bring claims who otherwise wouldn't have done so if they were paying for it themselves. Now, hidden in amongst those no-win, no-fee arrangements were a couple of quite substantial costs. One was something called a success fee, and a success fee arose in a successful claim, as the name suggests, whereby solicitors were allowed a so-called uplift of up to 100% on their costs. So that meant the losing defendant would be paying twice for the solicitor's work. Also included as another hidden cost was a type of insurance that claimants could buy after the event to insure against the possibility that they might lose the claim, and therefore the costs of the solicitors were covered and also their experts. And as you can imagine, that again substantially increased the amounts that were being paid out in compensation. In the mid-2000s, there were further changes that allowed certain defendants, such as the NHS Litigation Authority, to pay claims in a stepped manner, so-called periodic payment orders. The way that those work is that rather there being a lump sum payment to a claimant once a claim has been settled, the defendant pays normally an interim payment to cover things like changes to accommodation, and then on a regular basis makes future payments. On the one hand, that might sound like a good idea, but unfortunately it meant that liabilities for organisations such as the Litigation Authority were pretty much unlimited, particularly as patients live for longer and longer due to advances in medical care and treatment. Things had to change, and in 2013 changes to the way that claims were litigated were brought in. That meant that claimants could no longer allow a success fee or have allowed a success fee, so that cost was saved. It also meant that they could no longer get after the event insurance to cover the cost of their solicitor's fees, although it still could be claimed for the cost of expert fees. Now, if that sounds all too good to be true, it was balanced by changes that affected defendants too. And the major of these was a sudden one-off increase to what are called general damages of 10%. General damages are those damages which are given to patients who have suffered injury for pain, suffering and loss of amenity. But I'm sure you'll agree 10% as a one-off increase is substantial indeed. And there was also something called qualified one-way cost shifting, which meant that if a claimant brought a claim and wasn't successful, the losing party, i.e. the defendant, couldn't get their costs back. Now, if that doesn't sound bad enough, there was a further change that you might have read about in the papers that came in earlier this year and in fact became effective from only this week. And that change is the discount rate. Now, without wanting to get too technical, the discount rate is a calculation that allows for the fact that a claimant receiving a lump sum would be able to invest that money and therefore it would grow. So therefore the amount that they get is discounted by that expected rate of return. For many years it was 2.5%, but the Lord Chancellor announced earlier this year that that rate will be cut to minus 0.75%. So as you can see, it's no longer a discount rate, but in fact is a surcharge rate, because lump sums will now have to be inflated by 0.75%. And if you thought that will have only limited effect, believe me, for large claims it will have substantial and immediate effect. In fact, there was a report in the newspapers today about a claim that has just been settled by the NHS, which earlier this year was valued at about £3.5 million and has in fact, because it was settled this week after the change to the discount rate, now it's valued at just under £10 million. So it's almost tripled in a matter of weeks.
So as Mike said, this has had a considerable impact on claims over the years, and I think it's well illustrated by this graph, which shows the recent picture, the past 20 years or so, of medical liability inflation against house price inflation, which of course was also quite high in that period, wages and the RPI. And the medical liability inflation is shown there in red and has outstripped all other forms of inflation over recent years. Claims awards in England are now higher than almost any other country in the world, and the picture is perhaps most stark when seen in this next graph, which gives the picture since 1885, and you can see that the other measures are barely showing on the graph, whereas medical liability inflation is increasing rapidly. So Mike mentioned the impact of the claims on the NHS-LA, and now is an opportunity for you to use your voting buttons. So the question is, how much do you think was needed in 2016 to pay for known and future NHS hospital medical negligence claims? And you have three options: A, 764 million, B, 1.2 billion, and C, 56 billion. So if you could use your voting buttons now to pick the option that you think is most likely correct, and we'll just give you a few moments to do that. So we've got about 60% of people voted so far. We'll just give it a few more seconds. Okay, now 80% of people have voted, so it's still going up. So okay, fine. So we'll close the vote now, and it's interesting to see, you'll see the results are being shared with you, that the vast majority of people have selected 1.2 billion, which indeed does sound like a large sum of money to be spending on claims. However, the actual answer is 56 billion. This clearly is a huge amount and actually represents a significant proportion of the NHS operating costs, which are valued at about 110 billion per year. What this means at the moment is over £2,000 per taxpayer. And as Mike has talked about the claims inflation doubling every 7 years, that means that a claim today valued at 9 million would in 2023 be valued at 18 million. And that of course doesn't take account of the discount rate that we've already been talking about. So I'll hand back to Mike, who will talk about the MDU campaign to try to rectify some of these concerns.
Caroline, thank you very much, and the points that you brought out I think are really important because we're talking about not only massive costs, 56 billion, but we're also talking about a rate of increase that just shows no signs of slowing down whatsoever. So you won't be surprised, I don't think, to hear that we take this very seriously indeed, and we have a fair compensation campaign that's ongoing and has been for a short while now. Fundamentally, what we say the problem is that when you are calculating these very large claims, what the law allows is for claimants to say that all their future care will be provided by the private sector, irrespective of the arrangements that might be available locally, irrespective of how good the NHS or local authority might be at providing the equivalent types of care. Now, there are two strands to our campaign. As you can see, there's something called the Law Reform Personal Injuries Act 1948, and that is the bit that allows claimants to claim the cost of future health care as being provided in the private sector. We say that the particular section that allows that should be repealed so that claimants should be able to receive the benefits and society should receive the savings of patients being treated within the NHS. Now, a second strand is to do with our proposal that there be packages of care, and these packages of care will be tailored to types of disability and types of need. And we propose that that is decided by an independent body. For example, it could be NICE. And these packages of care would be able to be provided by a mix of providers, either private or public, or a mixture of funding from both. What our two proposals would do, we say, is that it would immediately begin to bring down the rate of increase. Clearly, 56 billion is a figure that's here to stay. That won't get any smaller. But if we can reduce the rate at which it's going up, then it at least allows future governments and society to decide how best to meet those spiralling costs. The other benefit, we say, is that where money is then ploughed back into the into the public sector rather than the private sector, more people will benefit from it. And so therefore it does have other subsidiary benefits apart from the obvious one of reducing costs in the longer term.
Thank you, Mike. And we had a question from Paul, who's joined, who has asked about what the MDU is indeed doing to press for changes to the law. So Paul, I hope that Mike has answered your questions there, but there is a link in the presentation to the fair compensation pages, which hopefully you'll be able to click on afterwards, and that will give you more information. Otherwise, we'll be happy to follow up on that with you at the end. But moving on to the changing landscape of NHS care, we've talked about what's happened in the indemnity landscape, but actually the 5-year forward view that was published in October 2014 set out the need to change healthcare, the evolving need to meet new challenges of longer life expectancy and increasingly complex healthcare problems. The 5-year forward view in particular set out options that you will all be familiar with today, the multi-speciality community provider, integrated hospital and GP care. And likewise the primary and acute care systems, again looking at integrating hospital care with primary care. And whichever of these models is being followed, it's absolutely clear that the foundation of the NHS is list-based primary care. But what we're seeing as people start to consider options under the 5-year forward view are evolving roles. So we're seeing new roles that haven't previously been utilised, but also a broadening scope of originally used roles. And whilst we're going through our experience, it would be helpful if you might put in what you're seeing in your areas. Our experience has seen paramedics taking on not only the usual role of urgent transport to hospital, but also undertaking home visits in primary care. Likewise, we've seen pharmacists who we've become increasingly familiar with them undertaking medication reviews, but actually now we're seeing them working in a triage role and in acute medical services settings. We're seeing musculoskeletal practitioners, rather than being a route of referral from primary care, as actually the cornerstone of, for example, chronic back pain clinics, and often they're running these in isolation for large federations. We're seeing increasing use of physician associates, and indeed a widening role of advanced nurse practitioners. Likewise, the 5-year forward plan set out a role for care navigators, a pathfinder role upskilling practice admin staff to manage clinical correspondence and also signpost patients to the right clinical care. With all of these roles we're seeing, the key issues are clearly ensuring appropriate training, supervision, and in particular, clear protocols, identifying exactly what the scope of people's responsibilities are, and indeed most importantly from an indemnity risk point of view, where they should go when things aren't going to plan and what the options are to seek urgent help. And with that in mind, we'll move on to look at a scenario which will illustrate the varying things that we see when there are lots of practitioners involved in care. Before we do that, actually, we have a question from Michelle, who says that they are employing a group of practices considering employing a physiotherapist to run a back pain clinic. Is this common, and what do we need to consider? Thank you for the question, Michelle. As we say, certainly we're seeing this is indeed much more common, and hopefully I've answered the question about considerations in terms of ensuring clear referral lines, responsibilities, protocols, and making sure that any indemnity arrangement you have in place covers all aspects of the care. Thank you. So I'll move on to the scenario. There is rather a lot of text on this slide, and I will give you a minute to read it, but whilst reading through it, it would be helpful if you could consider these points. The clinical governance and who should be involved. How the organisation might investigate this and respond to it. What might be the situation regarding liability for both the pharmacist and the paramedic, and what might constitute appropriate indemnity arrangements in this situation. So I'll just give you 1 minute to read through this scenario, and then we'll go on to discuss the points. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to consider that now, and we'll move on to talk about the points. Do feel free to type in any points as we're talking, but In general terms, in terms of the clinical governance and who should be involved, whenever responding to an adverse incident, it's important that everybody involved in it has an input. So here we need to see input from the pharmacist, the paramedic, the out-of-hours service, and also the hospital to understand what actually happened when John arrived in hospital. We need a senior manager to oversee the response, because whilst this involves various practitioners, complainants need one response that covers all aspects of care, and therefore somebody must oversee this. In terms of liability, traditionally with pharmacists and paramedics, these would have had individual indemnity arrangements. So when we look as to what is an appropriate indemnity arrangement, as we've talked about before, one size does not always fit all. It's about looking at what solution will best suit your organisation. If you want a single piece of paper with a wraparound option, those solutions are available with indemnity for all of the practitioners involved in your organisation. Likewise, it may equally suit you to have people with their own individual indemnity, but clearly when that is the case, somebody must be in a coordinating role to ensure that each and every person is appropriately indemnified and there are no gaps in the arrangements. And these are things that we can happily discuss with you and talk about bespoke, flexible solutions, as there are many options out there. So Mike, I'll hand over to you to go back to the scope of medical practice.
Caroline, thank you very much. And just picking up a couple of comments that are coming in, and Robert quite rightly highlights the importance of vicarious liability, which we will certainly touch on that. Now, one of the points that Caroline emphasised was that your indemnity arrangements need to be adequate and appropriate. Well, what does that mean? I would say a good starting point is to look at the doctors regulator, the GMC, to see what it says. And this is what it says in its ethical guidance. And there is also regulatory guidance in statutes that now applies as well as this. But you'll see they say you must have adequate and appropriate indemnity so that your patients won't be disadvantaged if they make a claim about the clinical care that you provided in the UK. So adequate and appropriately indemnified, and that is needed so that patients aren't in a situation of bringing a claim but there is no one who is able to pay for that. Now, those of you who work as GPs will probably say, well, most of this is included in the benefits of membership with the organisation who provides me indemnity. If there are any of you who are employed GPs or who perhaps do work for trusts or other organisations, you may be surprised to know that the NHS indemnity that might apply doesn't include a whole host of things, and these are shown on the outside of that particular diagram. Now, why do you need indemnity? You need it to meet the cost of claims when they arise. And one of the puzzling things is how long you need to have indemnity for. And before we answer that question directly, what we'd like to do is have another poll to pick your brains and see what you think. So this question is, what's the longest time between a clinical incident occurring and a claim being notified as a result of that incident? Is it 6 years, 11 years, 22 years, or 40 years? So the poll is now open, and if you would like to give your estimate of what the longest time between incident and claim notification is, we will then give you the answer based on our experience. I can see that 70% have now voted. We'll give you a couple of moments longer. There's still voting going on. And I think we've probably reached the maximum number of voters now. So I'll close the poll. And what you said was just under half said 40 years, and almost a third said 22 years. And very few of you thought it was a short period of time, such as 6 or 11. And the correct answer is, keep you in suspense, yes, well done to the 49% of you who said 40 years. That is correct, and I'm sure you'll agree that's an astonishingly long period of time. This was another GP case, and the incident arose in the 1960s. From memory, it was 1967, and it concerned a GP-led maternity unit, which in the 60s and 70s wasn't that uncommon. It was a very well-run unit, and they had a very clear protocol that they followed. Unfortunately, there was a particular woman who was labouring, and she was labouring for just under 2 days, and she required transfer to a consultant-led hospital unit. And the GP arranged that at precisely the correct time. There was a further delay when the woman was admitted to the hospital, and the child suffered brain damage as a result of the various delays. And the claim was that the GP should have referred the woman to hospital at a much earlier stage. But in fact, the GP was able to rely on expert evidence that the MDU had obtained, which said at that time it was common practice to allow a woman to labour for up to 48 hours. And indeed, it was entirely consistent with the protocol that was in existence at that time. So the matter was successfully defended, but the point, though, is the important thing here. The fact that something can be brought so many years after the event means that when you're thinking about what is adequate and what is appropriate, you also need to bear in mind how long will the benefits of my indemnity persist for after I retire or leave clinical practice or something of that nature. Now, I'm just, there have been a few more questions that have come in. Robert has asked a question, which is, how long does a patient have to make a claim against a GP? I have heard 21 or 25 years from various sources. Robert, I think these might be different figures that we're talking about here. Normally, under the statute of limitations, a claim has to be brought within 3 years of the date of the incident that gave rise to that claim, or 3 years after the claimant had knowledge that they had the basis for a claim, whichever comes later. But it's that latter point which tends to be the most important. So you, for example, might have treatment in 1980. That treatment may be negligent, but you might not be aware that something was wrong, and therefore you have the basis for a claim until much, much later. So that explains why, particularly with children, we see claims many, many years after the event in question. The 21 to 25 years relates to various indemnity options that are offered to GPs and organisations, which I hope we'll come to a little bit later on if you bear with us. What I'd like to just touch on now are a couple of indemnity options that you will see offered by providers, and it's just to give you a very brief overview of what these terms actually mean. And specifically, I'm going to start with occurrence and claims made, and then Caroline will go on to discuss other types of indemnity and the terms that you might see. In essence, occurrence indemnity is the traditional type. GPs who have perhaps been our members or members of other traditional medical defence organisations will be familiar with that. For the payment of a subscription, the person who receives the benefit of that indemnity is entitled to seek our assistance at any future point for matters that arose when they were in benefit of that membership, i.e. for the particular period where they had occurrence indemnity. Claims made is slightly different in that you obviously have to be someone who had the benefit of that type of indemnity at the period where the incident arose, but also that must still be operational at the time when the claim is notified or the basis for a claim is notified. So it is a slightly different model, and what the former does, it gives complete peace of mind. Once you've paid for your occurrence benefits of membership, then you know going forward that is fine. With claims made, the position is that in order to receive benefits going forward into the future, there will normally have to be a payment made in order for you to be able to come back to the organisation and say, okay, it's 10 years since I retired, but a claim has now happened, and will you assist? So very, very broadly, those are the two types and the two names that you might see mentioned in literature.
Thank you, Mike. And the other terms that you might often hear are discretionary versus insured. Discretionary is the type of assistance that you'll be more familiar with from the traditional MDOs, and the level of assistance provided is at the discretion of the Board of Management. This rather differs from an insurance policy, which of course you'll be very familiar with in, as Mike said, your household insurance, car insurance, and it comes with a long list of policy exclusions potentially and excess payments. Discretion offers a rather broad remit as to where we may or may not be able to assist, whereas insured assistance is within whatever the contractual terms are of the policy. It's important to bear in mind the difference between the traditional discretionary MDOs and the commercial insurers. At the MDU and our other MDO counterparts, we operate on a not-for-profit basis, whereas the commercial insurers have considerations to think about profits for shareholders, brokers' fees, insurance premium tax, which later this year goes up to 12%. So clearly, when you're looking at any quotes for products that you may wish to purchase, you need to bear in mind the basis on which these are offered and what the offering might be. We've had a few more questions, and hopefully, Dominic, thank you for yours. The corporate team will deal with that for you separately. So we'll move on to look at the next scenario, which shows one of our claims.
Caroline, thank you. And on your screens now is our second scenario. This one has slightly less reading involved, but once again, if I could prime you to think about a couple of things as you're reading it. Think of whether it's clear where liability might lie in this circumstance, where you have a corporate body and a nurse working within that arrangement. Think about who the patient might sue, and think of any risks that might arise if indemnity is not adequate. So I'll just give you a minute or so just to read that in your own time, and then we'll move on to discuss it. Hopefully I'm not jumping the gun here, but as it's a shorter scenario, hopefully you have now all had the chance to have a read of it. So first point, is it clear where liability might lie? It would be tempting to say, oh yes, it's glaringly obvious, it must be the organisation. Well, it rather depends on the exact way that that organisation has been set up. It rather depends who is responsible for that nurse. Is the nurse working there on a self-employed basis? Is the nurse employed? Is the nurse lent to that organisation by another group? So it can be quite complex. Second point, who might the patient sue? By and large, you will find claimant lawyers, when they are deciding who to sue, they spread their net as wide as they possibly can initially, and then they narrow it down once they have more information. So it is not at all unusual to see a pleaded claim at the outset, including both the nurse and the nurse's employer. And once the relationship between the two has more clarity, then often they will pursue just the one defendant. The other point is risk. Indemnity is, as we've heard, it's necessary. You have to have it. It's not an optional extra. The question is whether the arrangements that you've got for your organisation or you're thinking about for your organisation are adequate and appropriate. Now, imagine the circumstances if they were inadequate and inappropriate. Now, depending on who was responsible for putting those arrangements into place, there is clearly a risk to the individual. You've all seen what the GMC has said, and by and large, if you breach GMC guidance, you are at risk of a referral to them and an investigation under their fitness to practice procedures. And similar arrangements apply for other healthcare professions. But there's also, I'm sure you'd agree, a real organisational risk here. Healthcare organisations are by and large thought of and highly regarded by members of the public. And consequently, they need to be seen to be conducting themselves absolutely properly when it comes to their financial and other arrangements. So in circumstances where a patient might be disadvantaged, which you'll remember that was the term used by the GMC, it's certainly more than likely that the organisation's reputation would suffer. So there are both individual and there are organisational risks. Just to briefly bring you up to date with what happened in this case, I'm pleased to say that this was one of those circumstances where there was in fact appropriate indemnity in place. Our experts and experienced claims handlers obtained a supportive expert opinion and the claim was successfully defended.
Thank you, Mike. And I'll move on in a moment to talk about multiple jeopardy, but just picking up on another question we've had, which does rather illustrate the complexities when there are various people in different organisations. Bilal asks us, we've been increasingly pressured to form large groups as GPs to provide 7-day care from an 8 till 8 service, and this will involve multiple practices employing salaried or locum staff. And he's asking about the medico-legal issues. I think the key points here are looking at lines of accountability and clear protocols and considering who is responsible for each of the clinicians involved. And like we've mentioned before, I think when looking at these options, it's important to get together as a group and consider these matters carefully. And again, if it would be helpful, we can ask our team who look at the bespoke solutions to contact you to discuss this in more detail afterwards. Likewise, we've had another question about an advanced nurse practitioner and who is responsible for the advanced nurse practitioner's indemnity. Certainly we do have individual indemnity arrangements we can offer for advanced nurse practitioners, so thank you for the question, Annette. Again, there can be wraparound options available as well, so that is something we can liaise with you about if that would be helpful. So I think that's the question so far. So if we move on to talk about multiple jeopardy. So far today we've mainly been talking about claims, but if there is a clinical incident, and thinking of one that might apply in primary care and indeed lead to all of these lines of investigation, we've certainly seen over the years a number of cases where patients have been given the wrong dose of opiate medication. sadly all too easy to do when clicking on prescriptions, and then patients can take these for a number of days, and sadly we have seen some that have resulted in the patient's death. When that happens, or even in a much lesser adverse incident where death is not relevant, there are a number of lines of investigation that can follow. MDO membership offers not only the indemnity for civil claims, but also assistance with all of these lines of investigation. Mike's talked already about the possibility of GMC investigation, and indeed these can be extremely stressful. They can go on for a very long time and can run into thousands and tens of thousands of pounds in terms of defence. It's not at all uncommon for a fitness to practice hearing to run to over £50,000 or even into the hundreds of thousands of pounds. So again, as we're coming to the close of the formal part of our presentation, it's just a case of saying that when looking at the options you might want to consider that best suit your organisation and the individuals within it, it's not only the civil claims but also the wider lines of investigation that can follow. So that brings us to the close of the formal part of our talk, and just to summarise, we've looked at the long-standing background to medical indemnity and the new options that are emerging and are available. We've highlighted your professional and contractual obligation to have both adequate and appropriate indemnity in place for whatever services you may be offering. And clearly the 5-year forward plan has given new care models and new ways of working, which provides new risks but also new opportunities. And in looking to take advantage of these opportunities, we would ask that you engage with any potential indemnifiers early on to discuss proposals. There are understandably many questions around at the moment as to responsibilities and what options might be available. And certainly from our perspective, we're quite clear that one size most certainly does not fit all, and it will be important for us to work with you to ensure that any solution is bespoke for your organisation and flexible to meet the needs. This of course applies to many of the indemnifiers, but we'd ask that if you are looking to arrange something that you contact us early and bear us in mind. And I hope that's been helpful. What we'll do now is move on to look at some further questions, and I think we have a few more through. So one of the questions we have is, what if legal action is taken out against my surgery because there have been so many touch points in a patient's care, it's unclear where liability rests. Am I covered? I think, Tristan, this comes to the point of ensuring within an organisation that you are absolutely clear what individuals are doing and what sort of indemnity arrangements they have in place. Certainly our own claims handling experience is extremely strong. We robustly defend our claims and do so with about an 80% success rate. And clearly one of the things that we look at when defending claims is ensuring that all those involved are fully investigated. But it certainly goes to the point of making sure that your organisation has clear plans in place to make sure that all staff are appropriately covered.
Thank you. And Andrew has got a question. Andrew asks, as an out-of-hours provider organisation, could we be held vicariously liable if a self-employed GP was found not to have adequate indemnity and we had not checked, or is a GP's declaration that they have suitable cover sufficient? Andrew, my advice would be that you should make adequate and at least preliminary inquiries of anyone who you engage. And I think as a minimum you would probably want to see a letter or some form of confirmation from the person who they have an indemnity arrangement with to see what exactly that amounts to. because as we discussed a little bit earlier on, claims can be brought many years after the event. Claims can result in multi-million pound payments for damages. So you would need to be, I think, reasonably satisfied that both the amount was sufficient and also the duration that the indemnity arrangement would last for would be sufficient as well. If you have any specific questions you'd like to raise that with us after this event, then please do.
Thank you. We also have, as we mentioned at the start, Noel, who heads up our team that look at bespoke solutions here to help with answering the questions. And we have one about the MDU experience with GP federations and limited companies and nurses who work across patient lists. So Noel, you're probably best placed to answer that for us.
Yeah, hi Mike. This is a question we get regularly. The MDU works currently with over 60 GP federations, providing corporate indemnity solutions to them. Corporate membership of the MDU can extend to cover other healthcare professionals, including nurses, HCAs, etc., when they're working maybe across a patch of practices. So certainly the MDU has the ability to put in place solutions which can support other healthcare professionals. So if it's something you'd like us to discuss with you, please do drop us a line and I'll be happy to speak with you in more detail.
Thank you, Noel. We've also got a few questions with people asking us to pass names on to the team, and of course we will do that. Just checking so the questions have come in quite thick and fast, whether there are any more that we haven't covered here. Had one about the limits on policies. So a practice has been offered a quote for indemnity which is considerably less than they may get from one of the MDOs, and is offering a policy limit of 2 million, and again they're asking whether or not that would be sufficient. Noel, did you want to answer that?
When we look at the risk for corporate members, again, there's no one-size-fits-all. We'll look at things like the contractual responsibilities. For example, APMS contracts within the NHS come with specific indemnity limits, so the organisation, the provider organisation, would be asked to carry 5 million per claim, 10 million in the annual aggregate. Other contracts we see, or private services, might not have any contractual requirements, so really it's up to us working with you to put in place what we feel might be appropriate. So again, it's really a case-by-case basis. We would work with you to put in place the appropriate indemnity in that particular service.
Lovely, thank you. Well, I think the questions are slowing down now, so what we will do is look to move things to a close. We've got up on screen now the details of how to contact us, and clearly, as I say, a number of you have asked that we do make contact, and of course we will do that. We will also be sending out to you a copy of the learning objectives and our bespoke solutions brochure, and it falls to me to say thank you very much for listening this afternoon, and I do hope it has been helpful, and we're more than happy to follow up with any queries afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.